The IDF launches strikes in Gaza following a series of ceasefire violations by Hamas, leading to speculation about the resumption of the war. President Trump and Vice President Vance are backing Israel. The terrorists return remains of a hostage whose body was retrieved nearly 2 years ago, and now they're staging fake searches for the remaining dead bodies while the Red Cross looks on.
Shalom and welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Mark Regev, and as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum. How are you today, Ruthie?
Aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play, you mean? Yes, no, I mean, I'm okay, but we've really got to talk about whether the war, we know that there's a ceasefire or not ceasefire, but I need to ask you, are we going back to war against Hamas right now or soon?
So there's a predicament facing Israel, okay? Let's put it straight on the table. Hamas is violating the ceasefire. Number one, and most importantly, it had an obligation to release all the hostages dead and alive, and we still have, 3 weeks after the ceasefire kicked in, we still have 13 dead Israeli hostages, all the live returned, all the 13 dead Israeli hostages still in Gaza, and the assumption is Hamas knows where practically all of them are. There might be one or two, maybe Hamas has lost because of bombings or so forth. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, and let's say 3. I'm not sure they deserve the benefit of the doubt, of course. But still, they've got 13 people who haven't been returned, and that's a serious breach, a serious violation of the ceasefire agreement. Secondly, and not less important, is last week we had 2 soldiers who were killed in Hamas attack on Israeli forces on our side of the yellow line, yes, where according to the ceasefire, we are allowed to be. That's part of the arrangement. And at the time, Hamas said it was an accident. You know, they use this sort of image like they don't have communication with all their soldiers, and these are people who don't know that the ceasefires come into place. And let's be, they talk like it's the Pacific in 1946 and the Japanese soldiers on some faraway island, right? The Gaza Strip is not a huge place. There are no faraway islands. The idea that these soldiers maybe didn't know there's a ceasefire. So when it happened very close to the declaration of the ceasefire, so you could say, okay, maybe they hadn't heard. Maybe. Once again, do they deserve the benefit of the doubt? No. But we can give it. And President Trump sort of said, well, that's what they say, maybe. But 3 weeks into the ceasefire, to say that their forces didn't know, that's really pushing things too far. So we lost another soldier yesterday, and Israel responds. Now, I said at the beginning, and I'd like to hear your take on this, I said Israel faces a dilemma, because on one hand, they're flagrant violations of the ceasefire. It's clear the Americans are saying, 1, Hamas has to release all the hostages, all the dead hostages. They all have to return. It's clear the Americans are saying Israel has a right to respond when they violate the ceasefire. But it's also clear to me the Americans are saying that Israel shouldn't rock the boat too much, that the ceasefire is a process and they want us to stick to it.
Okay, but you know what? You're also forgetting to mention the grotesque display that Hamas, it's not merely, maybe they didn't find all the bodies. First of all, last week, they sent a body that wasn't an Israeli hostage. Okay. Then they said, we're returning another body. And then it went through DNA testing, and it turns out it was partial remains of a dead hostage who had been murdered by Hamas 2 years ago and whose body had been retrieved by IDF forces in November 2023. And his family says now they have to open the grave a 3rd time because this isn't the first time they've been given partial remains. So that's one thing. Then this morning, they announced the names, specific names of 2 dead hostages. And they said, we've got them. We know where they are. Ha ha. And we're not giving them to you because you violated the ceasefire. This is all going on. But to make matters worse, it turns out they said, okay, we agreed. And the United States agreed to let Egyptian forces bring in bulldozers to help Hamas and the Red Cross, supposedly, locate the hostages. Okay, and then drone footage. We see it on a camera. Or Hamas is staging fake search operations. They dig a hole. They poured a body wrapped in a white garbage bag or sheet. Pour it in, dump dirt over it, then have the bulldozer go in as though it found the body. And then they said to the Red Cross, come on, you see, we just found a body. They are staging it. They know where the bodies are. Don't give me this business about, well, maybe they don't know where all of them. It doesn't even matter. That we could accept if they, on the day they were supposed to return all of them with the live hostages, we had, 10 returned and they were still searching for the 3. The other point, though, is it's not whether the United States is asking Israel to hold back. Okay, I know the New York Times likes to say there's a rift and America is telling us what to do and we're going to blah, 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 blah. The fact is that Trump says Hamas is a small part of this greater operation. And, if they don't do what they're supposed to do, they're going to be obliterated. Now, we've heard that before. But what he's basically saying is, Israel, that's up to you. And we know it. And that's So the question is, are we hesitating? We don't want to send in our reservists all over again, the ones who came home and the ones who... I don't know. But I can tell you one thing, that Hamas is doing this on purpose because this is phase 1 of the so-called, of the 20-point Trump plan or whatever. And phase 2 is that they are disarming. So they don't want to get to phase 2. And that is what is happening right now. And the question is, in this chicken game, who is going to, and let me tell you, I don't care what the international community says or anybody else. If this keeps up, and it's torture. Okay, they're torturing the families with we know where the bodies are, we don't, we do. And I'll tell you something, if that keeps up, we are going to have no choice. By the way, yesterday we had heavy bombing, thanks to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who ordered the army to do it. And it wasn't just because a soldier was killed. He was killed after we ordered the heavy bombing. And that is why Hamas said we violated the ceasefire. Anyway, they are not only murderers and rapists, but they're also liars. Surprise, surprise.
So we're not surprised, but you sort of, by saying you don't know, you sort of avoided my question. Because I said Israel faces a dilemma. Everything you said about Hamas behavior is 100% correct. And I said Israel nevertheless faces a dilemma because we could restart the war, right? And in fact, we could restart the war under better conditions. And the better conditions are there aren't live hostages in Gaza. Therefore, we can target places that we didn't target before. Hamas can no longer use live Israelis as human shields for their war machine. That's the bottom line, right? There aren't in Hamas hands live Israelis since the beginning of this deal, where they had to release in the first 2 days of the deal all the hostages, right? All the live hostages. But Israel, so far, despite this second violation, the second shooting of an Israeli soldier, there have been more violations. But, when they kill Israeli soldiers, that's upping the ante, so to speak. Once again, that continues, and they refuse to release all the dead hostages, which they're obliged to do. So we could say, if it was a legal case, if we were before a court, we could say they're violating the agreement. We reserve the right then, the agreement's off. The agreement isn't based on one side abiding by the agreement, the other side not. That's clear. But we in Israel, at least the government of Israel, has chosen not to do that. The government of Israel has decided to hit back hard when we need to hit back hard, but to do it in the framework of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I don't know if that's the correct analogy here, but to agree to what President Trump seems to be saying, which is, let's give this the chance. Let's give this a chance to work. These are like teething problems. And if Hamas doesn't play ball, and then he threatens Hamas with obliteration, I think it's dangerous, the current situation, because this could has the potential of becoming the new reality. If you are correct that Hamas doesn't want to get to stage 2, because stage 2 means they have to disarm, do they want to drag out stage 1? And we will have an ongoing war of attrition in Gaza. Having said that, once we understand it's a long war, maybe we do already, so we will have a very low casualty rate. We'll get our forces in position, and we'll start doing limited ground insurgents into area where the peace agreement says that they're supposed, not the peace agreement, the ceasefire agreement says that they are. In other words, once we understand that, so we can act accordingly. And once again, our forces will be prepared to meet these challenges, and we'll hit back hard. And of course, From Gaza's perspective, there won't be any reconstruction. There won't be problems on the deliveries of humanitarian aid. It means more of the same, though maybe more of the same with more advantageous situation for Israel, precisely because they no longer have the Israeli human shields.
Well, you're absolutely right. But the worry is it's not just that, yes, and we're being cautious. Everything you say is right. The trouble is that with each passing day, they're actually strengthening again. The trouble is Hamas is recruiting new terrorists, teenagers. Doesn't matter they're teenagers. I mean, the average age in Gaza always has been low. They're recruiting more terrorists. And apparently, with all these searches for the so-called searches for the dead bodies, they're also finding a lot of weapons that were left behind in tunnels, etc.
Or hidden away.
And they're collecting them again. And with each passing day, now don't forget, they're also getting humanitarian aid. It's the same, that cycle again, which is to say, if they're allowed to rear their ugly head again, it's true, we killed all their leadership, etc. But with each passing day right now, they could be strengthening. So what you're describing sounds to me like what the situation we have with Lebanon, which is every time Hezbollah makes a false move, we attack. We attack the Hezbollah targets, not Lebanon. We attack Hezbollah targets and terrorists. Although there has been talk that, Hezbollah actually, we thought it was defeated and it's not quite, and it's also rebuilding. And one thing all Israelis say on the left, the right, and the center, of course, the left says it from a disingenuous point, is that we do not want to return to October 6th, the situation on October 6th, where we say, okay, and we give them benefit of doubt, and the benefit of the doubt, and we give them aid, and we're rebuilding, et cetera, because we will be faced again with another October 7th massacre if we're not careful. And because there's no guarantee that we will have a conservative government in Israel and one in the United States in the next round. It could happen again if we are not ultra careful. And I mean, you know me, I always say, listen, if it's us or them, it's got to be us. And we have to keep our powder dry. And when need be, we have to attack and mean it seriously.
So always, as a golden rule, Israel should always be ultra realistic, know who we're up against, and have no illusions about the neighborhood or about some of these actors on our borders, yes? I think, however, and maybe it's my personality, I'm often looking for the shiny side of the situation, the positive side of the situation. If you compare where we were before the ceasefire, where we still had hostages in Gaza, 20 live hostages in Gaza, and we were fighting and so forth, if this turns into an ongoing war of attrition, I believe it's advantageous to the previous situation. First of all, we got all the live hostages out. And secondly, I think our positions in Gaza, if there have to be movements on the ground, and there was talk about that yesterday, if this continues, we could move forces around and so forth. So I think if we're continuing the conflict in this new situation, it's not necessarily to Israel's disadvantage. How can this change, though? If we're now in this negative spiral to this sort of low-level war of attrition in Gaza, okay, where we act where we need to act and we respond to them and so forth and so on, what is a way to avoid a spiral into that sort of situation? And here I think a lot of the keys are with the United States, and specifically with their ability to leverage Hamas's best friends, which is Turkey and Qatar. If the Americans put pressure on them the way they did to put the pressure on to get the ceasefire, then maybe you could get implementation of stage one. Maybe, question mark, I'm not 100% sure. But if there's a chance of this happening, it's only because that sort of negotiating skill that the Americans used, that President Trump used, to get the whole Arab world and the Muslim world to say, Hamas, you have to agree to this. You have to release all the hostages. You have to release this ceasefire. So they agreed, and obviously they're trying to renege now. Can Trump use the same leverage he had 3 weeks ago, again today, to enforce Hamas's standing by its obligations under the ceasefire?
Okay, so there are two things. A, why does he need to ask them again? They're part of this 20-point plan. Why does he need to ask them? Why aren't they immediately doing it themselves. And then that brings me to B, which is Qatar and Turkey are Israel's sworn enemies. And don't give me this about how they're not our official. I don't care. Erdogan has made it clear. President Erdogan of Turkey has said Israel has to be destroyed. He wants to be the new neo-Ottoman emperor. He wants to establish himself in Syria and in Gaza. He is an anti-Semite, anti-Israel. He hates Israel, and he has been responsible for all kinds of terrible events in and around Gaza. And Qatar has been doing that as an enemy of the West. Okay, I know President Trump is friends with him now, and I get all of that, what you like to call realpolitik. But, meanwhile, President Trump is saying we're going to defund universities, cut federal U.S. funding from universities like Harvard because of its woke and disgusting and anti-Semitism on campus, while Qatar is funding all of that stuff. So we have a slight problem here, all right? But what I need to know, why does President Trump, they already said Hamas is defeated, Hamas has to give in, and you say, maybe President Trump can again leverage it. Why?
Well, because
Why?
they were...
they're bad guys, Mark.
Okay, but
why.
they were, from Trump's perspective, the guarantors who brought Hamas to the table to agree to this, okay? And if they are sort of, how do you say, they're the godfathers of this ceasefire for the Hamas side.
Mm-hmm.
And if Hamas is violating the agreement, as it is by not releasing the
Right.
dead hostages, by continuing the war against Israeli soldiers, even though they redeployed to these agreed to lines, if that is happening, so they can be held accountable and should be held accountable.
But in what way? Accountable.
America has leverage
America's
with these countries. Well, the best
Okay.
example is the Turks
F-15
want you,
jets.
not F-15s, F-35s.
Oh,
Ruthie.
F-35.
I'm correcting you for a change, yes?
Sorry, F-35.
Turkey wants these advanced aircraft from the United States. Turkey wants other things from the United States. The Qataris want things from the Americans. In other words, I think it's important, and maybe it's going on behind the scenes and we're not aware of it, that there is American pressure on Turkey and Qatar to deliver. I don't see another way. Why Hamas is playing games. It's clear. That's who Hamas is. It's like, why does a scorpion sting people? Because that's what a scorpion is, right? We know who Hamas is. I have no illusions about Hamas. But if one wants to go down that pathway that is in this ceasefire agreement, right, with stage 1 and then move to stage 2, and Hamas is disarmed and a better future for Gaza, and all the things that everyone agreed to, right, then pressure I think we have to reignite the same pressure that was on Hamas when this was achieved 3 weeks ago. It has to be done again today. Having said that, and here I'm going to be brutally honest, it wasn't just the diplomatic pressure America on Turkey and Qatar to put pressure on Hamas. It was also Israeli military pressure. So it's possible, even if you want to go back to stage, on the pathway to stage 2 of this agreement, maybe Israel has to beef up the military pressure. And it'll be very interesting to see how all the Europeans respond to that. When it's clear the violations are on the, it's clear they are not releasing the dead hostages they committed to doing. It's clear that their forces continue to shoot at Israeli soldiers. If Israel decides we can't have just tick for tat, we have to escalate, where will they be then?
Right. Well, you say it's clear.
Yes.
But guess what? Look on the internet. Look at the Europeans. Look at all the hypocrites who are saying that it's actually Israel who has violated it and not Hamas. I know you say it's clear, right? But Europe right now, most of Europe, also is hostile to Israel and will take any opportunity to say that it's all our fault and we didn't, and they're hungry and whatever. We've seen that throughout the war. And my point to you, you're absolutely right that the White House has leverage with Qatar and Turkey. What I'm just saying is that it shouldn't need to use that leverage again, because right from the beginning, they said this is happening. A lot of us were skeptical, not skeptical about the let's say the long-term goals. Not that I ever believe, just as I say, unless there's a regime change in Iran, unless there's a regime change in Turkey, forget about having any relations that you can trust with Israel. But that's long term. In the short term, our hands are tied to the extent that There is a huge tunnel system, terror tunnel system in Gaza that we are not destroying. This is, when we talk about war, it's not just killing a lot of people. We have to demolish the terrorist infrastructure, and we're not doing it at the moment.
Well, let's be clear. Stage 2, as you said a moment ago, stage 2 of the agreement is the demilitarization, the disarming of Hamas. That's there, black on white. It has to happen, right? And Hamas should no longer rule the Gaza Strip. That's also there. And surprise, surprise, that's an Arab League decision, not known for being particularly friendly to Israel. The Arab League passed a resolution a few months ago saying Hamas should no longer rule Gaza, right? The question is, how will that happen? And once again, it will only happen because of pressure on Hamas. Look, Hamas's game plan to me I think is clear, right? Hamas wants to be, you talked about Lebanon before, they want to be like Lebanon before this recent changes. They want to be the power behind the throne. They're happy for there to be some sort of international sort of thing running Gaza, but they will control it behind the scenes like Hezbollah used to do in Lebanon, right? Nothing could happen in Lebanon. Had an official government that wasn't Hezbollah. Lebanon had an army that wasn't Hezbollah. Lebanon had courts that weren't Hezbollah, and they were all theoretically independent, but who called all the shots in Lebanon? It was Hezbollah. And everything, they were puppets. They were for show. It was theater. It's clear that Hamas wants to do that in Gaza. They want to keep the power. They want to keep the military strength. They want to keep that everyone's afraid of them and it has to do what they say. And they're willing for there to be theater, right? They're willing to be. That's the real challenge of stage 2 of this agreement. Once again, it'll only not happen if Hamas is forced to disarm. And that will only happen, I believe, like 3 weeks ago. A combination of Israeli military pressure and diplomatic pressure, as I say, from Hamas's closest friends. You said, the Qataris and the Turks are terrible and they're anti-Semitic and they're pro-Hamas. And that their deficiencies, yes, makes them effective vehicles to exert pressure on Hamas. Because when Hamas's closest friends say you have to do A, B, and C, maybe it matters.
No, you're absolutely right. It makes them effective in applying pressure on Hamas.
Correct.
But it also makes them effective in having a ploy for post-war Gaza in this Trump plan. Okay, they're devious. They've always been. They're liars and terrorist funders. I'm talking about Qatar and Turkey. And Egypt these days isn't much better. We'll get to that in another. That's for another discussion. And why I'm saying that is that we see also this talk of the Palestinian Authority. Suddenly it's making nice with Hamas, its big rival, because they have plans to say, okay, well, they won't be armed. It'll be just civil administration or some kind of this or some kind of, as you said, some kind of behind the scenes or something, political structure. Make no mistake, that happens. And again, as I keep saying, it's true we may be headed for post-war, but in Israel, we always have to see post-war as pre the next war, unfortunately.
So listen, that's the harsh reality. And anyone who thinks suddenly, the Israeli border with Gaza is going to look like the border with Canada, yes, it's not going to be like that, right? The U.S. border with Canada. Hamas isn't going to magically disappear. And this is a process. But I think if you look at it objectively, the way Netanyahu has handled it and the way he seems to be working well with Trump, by all indications, the process underway is not an easy process. But I think, once again, compared to this where we were 4 weeks ago to where we are today, in other words, before the ceasefire to where we are today, I think the situation is advantageous to Israel from a strategic point of view. And I think as the bonus, and maybe some people would say most importantly, we got all the live hostages out, right? That there aren't live hostages in Gaza is a major change. Not only from a moral point of view, we got our people out and they're back united with their families and they're being rehabilitated and so forth and so on. But it also takes away a strategic trump card that in many ways Hamas had. But this isn't going to be easy as we move forward. And that's why it's crucial, I think, that we keep the Israeli-American communication as close as is possible. Here there's been talk, of course, and it's been over the Israeli press, is Israel becoming a supplicant to the United States? Are we a vassal state? Do we not attack? There's stuff out there, and I saw in the media, we can't shoot back against Hamas unless we get an okay from Washington. It's ridiculous. Netanyahu said in a speech when Vance was here, he said, there are some people who say Israel controls America, and then other people say America controls Israel, right? And it's obviously they're both wrong, right? But there's no doubt, if we want to be brutally honest, like we're allies and we're partners, but America is the superpower and we are just the regional power. We're a strong regional power, but it's not an even relationship. And I think the government of Israel is right. We have to take into American requests into account, and we have to think, America wants this process to succeed, so we're on board with our eyes open, but we're on board. Having said that, I remember Netanyahu once said during Biden's time, yes, America is our best friend. And if we can agree with what America wants, of course we do. But if we need to say no, we have to say no.
Well, in a way, it was easier for Netanyahu to say that during Biden's tenure, easier than it is now, because actually Biden administration was hostile to Israel, and the Trump administration is very pro-Israel, and it's harder to say no to someone genuinely your friend, not just your ally. It's harder. But it's interesting that I would like to also make a point about the Israeli left. It's very important. While this is going on, as I mentioned earlier, the New York Times and all that, but the Israeli left spends every day in the newspapers and TV studios, in the media, going back to that old mantra that there is either a rift between Netanyahu and Trump, or Trump is now fed up with Netanyahu, or Netanyahu is afraid of Trump. They just are plugging this narrative again and again that actually the honeymoon's over. It's as though they're just dying. This is their country. I'm talking about the Israeli left. They're just dying. They're dying for the country to fail in its endeavors in order to put down Netanyahu. I know they want to defeat him, but it's not just that. It's like cut off your nose to spite your face. It's their own country. Now, as you said, it's nonsense about this big rift. It's true. There are some elements in the U.S. administration that are not as friendly to Israel, but forget about that for a moment. This program in Israel among the media and the left, which is actually much smaller than the patriotic Israelis, much, much smaller, but they're louder and they have all the cultural platforms. They would have you believe that A, we didn't win the war, B, whatever Netanyahu does is no good. If he goes to war, he's endangering the hostages. They are the ones who said end the war at all costs, and now that it's over, they're saying that's bad. Whatever Netanyahu does, they attack, and they don't realize that all they're doing is attacking their own country, and the Israel's let's say detractors outside are so happy to use it, so happy to echo it.
So I want to take issue and agree with part of what you say. I'll take issue first, so you'll have time to think about your response. I don't like it when you say there's the left and there are Israeli patriots. I believe that it's possible to be an Israeli patriot and just believe the government is wrong, and to have a different opinion and to criticize the government. It's also the job of the opposition to criticize the government. Israel's a parliamentary democracy. We're going to have elections within a year, right? Some people say, many columnists and people say they'll probably be earlier than later, but we have to have elections next year. By the end of October, I think it is, 2026, we have to have elections. And so as you get closer to election day, things become more partisan political, and that's only natural. I'm very careful with using words like, let's say Rabin made the Oslo Agreement and the right in Israel didn't like the Oslo Agreement, right? Or Sharon pulled out of Gaza and many people on the right thought he was wrong to pull out of Gaza, and maybe he was wrong. But to say that these people aren't patriotic Israelis, I don't accept that. You don't have to respond. You can if you want. You said something that I did agree with. You said it's harder for an Israeli government to say no to an American president who's been so friendly. And that when that president asks you to do something, it's much more difficult to stand there and say, no, we can't do this. And I think there's a diplomatic truth there. people often say, like the anti-Israel crowd in the United States, right? They'll say, oh, America should threaten to cut off aid. America should threaten to cut off diplomatic support of the UN. America should, unless they stop doing this or stop doing that, we are going to not send them any more weapons. That's called, in your face. And actually, when that sort of thing is talked about, or that's the atmosphere, so it is very easy for the Israeli prime minister to say, no, we disagree. And actually, the Israeli public will support him because Washington is perceived as being anti-Israel. It's much more difficult for an Israeli prime minister to say no to Washington when Washington is hugging Israel, where Washington is saying we're there for you, when Washington is giving you what you need at the UN, what you need, weapons, what you, the support. And then when he says, well, I've done all this for you, I just need you to do A, B, and C for me, it's much more difficult to say no. It's actually counterintuitive. But an administration that is pro-Israel, that everyone in Israel is convinced, they're on our side. What did they say when Trump was at the Knesset? We've never had such a pro-Israel president in the White House. It's very difficult to say no to a man like that. Maybe you can convince him while we're right, yes, but if he's stuck on something, very difficult. Not impossible, but very difficult to say no.
Absolutely. Okay, so I will just correct, as we wrap up our discussion today. I will, I take your point that it's possible to be on the Israeli left and still be called a patriot. What I meant by that was, I think I just define a patriot as somebody who actually is on the side of his country, wants his country to win, wants the best for his country. You were talking about it like I was discussing political differences, and it's the Israeli opposition is critical of the government, and that's always true. But let me tell you something. When in the past, when there have been left-wing governments, the right wing has never taken a position that in the world is anti its own country. So, it is true. When you said, Robin, with the Oslo Accords and disengagement, of course, I vehemently opposed those things, vehemently. And but the criticism of it wasn't, oh, Israel is a bad guy. The criticism of it was, no, this is phony peace and we don't want it. That was the argument. Today, when we're at war and you have left-wing journalists who would rather, they would rather watch their own government fail than support it. And I wasn't talking about politics, okay? I was talking about, it's almost gleeful when they show where we failed. It's almost happy that it went badly. And that is why I use that word. So you know what? But I do take your point. It's not fair to lump all leftists and to call them non-patriotic. But I would say their behavior has been very bad, in my view, very bad.
So I'll respond and I'll say the following. I think there is a problem with the opposition that nothing Netanyahu can do is good. They'll automatically post whatever he does, it's all wrong. And if he does the right thing, it's because America forced him to. They'll never give him credit. So you can say that's part of the opposition and that's their job. But I think it's more than that because, people talk about Netanyahu derangement syndrome. There's something similar people talk about Trump in America. It's just he drives, he's a very polarizing figure and he makes some people crazy, right? And they really do hate him. And it comes from their kishkas, it comes from their gut, so to speak. I remember, and we spoke about this, I think, 3 weeks ago, where David Brooks, I heard him on PBS. He hasn't had a nice word about Trump, right? Hasn't said a nice word about Trump since I don't know how long. And yet he praised Trump for helping get the peace deal, the ceasefire deal in Gaza, right? And I'd like to hear more Israelis who are very critical of Netanyahu. When he deserves credit, I think they should be able to give that credit. But it seems to be impossible. But we've run out of time, Ruthie. I'll see you next week. And next week we have a secret special guest who should show up, barring any last-minute changes. And I'm looking forward for the first time since we started doing these podcasts 2 years ago, a little less than
Year and a half
ago. We will have a special guest in our show, and we will wait for that.
Can't wait.